Hello, everyone. Welcome to the second of two lectures in the Gerstein Distinguished Visiting Professor Lecture Series. My name is Pamela Clausen. I'm the chair of the Department for the Study of Religion, and I'm very happy to be, the DSR is collaborating with the Anne Tannenbaum Center for Jewish Studies in hosting our guest, Professor Tracy Lemos, who's the Gerstein Distinguished Visiting Professor at the Anne Tannenbaum Center for Jewish Studies and the Department for the Study of Religion this term. And we were able to actually see each other in person last week, which was very nice. I'm very glad that we're able to have at least some in-person interaction with our wonderful visiting professor. Before introducing Professor Lemos in more detail, I want to take some time to acknowledge the land on which the University of Toronto operates, in which we work and study and gather. For thousands of years, this land has been the traditional territories of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, the Mississaugas of the Credit, and today this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island. And I am grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land and to think about what it means to do so. Professor Lemos, as you will already have noticed if you were at her first lecture, is a remarkably accomplished and very innovative scholar who works at the intersection of Hebrew Bible, early Judaism, religion, violence, and genocide studies. She's a professor at Huron College of Western University and received her PhD from Yale University in 2007. She is the author of many books and articles, some of which may have been mentioned on Monday as well, but I'm going to mention them again because they're so fascinating. At current, she's working on a book that we'll be hearing more about, I'm guessing, in the lecture to follow, called Animals No Longer, Dehumanization and Rehumanization Across Cultures. She's also the co-editor of a number of edited collections, which are quite a big contribution to the study of religion and Jewish studies in terms of the work required to pull them off, but also how they are really important resources for students. So I'll just mention a couple of them here. The Cambridge World History of Genocide, Volume 1, Genocide in the Ancient, Medieval, and Pre-Modern Worlds. A very interesting book that I cannot say the name of because it is in Swedish, but the English version is Violence and Weaponry in the World of the Bible and in Ours, 2 essays. And then her solo authored books are Violence and Personhood in Ancient Israel and Comparative Context with Oxford University Press, and Marriage, Gifts, and Social Change in Ancient Palestine, 1200 BCE to 200 CE with Cambridge. I'll also mention one more edited collection, co-edited collection, Worship, Women, and War, Essays in Honor of Susan Niditch, published by Brown University Press. And clearly, Professor Lemos's work is incredibly relevant to our time even today. She's currently teaching a course in the Department for the Study of Religion called Angry God, Violence and Warfare in Ancient Israel and the Ancient Near East. And today her lecture will draw on this work in progress. The lecture is called Dehumanization and Rehumanization in Early Judaism, Isaiah and Leviticus. So she'll give her talk, and then we'll have about 30 minutes for Q&A afterwards. So please join me in welcoming Professor Lemos.
Thank you, Pamela, for that generous introduction. And thank you to everyone at the Center for Jewish Studies for helping to set up this lecture series, and especially for inviting me to be the Gerstein Distinguished Visiting Professor this semester. Let me just share my screen with you here. Again. Okay. Among the artwork that survives from ancient West Asia, the vast corpus of Assyrian royal reliefs looms large. Ashurbanipal would surely take great pleasure in the fact that more than 2 millennia after his demise, viewers continue to marvel at his kingly splendor. We gaze as ancient enemies did on images of his subjugation of cities and his domination over even the most fearsome predators, as he himself becomes the one, the only apex predator without rival. In one scene, Ashurbanipal sinks a sword through a lion's underbelly so deep that it emerges through the other side, the lion's gaping maw just a foot or two from the king's own impassive face as he valiantly deals his death blow. This proximity of suprahuman monarch without rival to predator turned prey is as stunning as it is improbable. In another famous relief, the Assyrian king Tiglath-Pileser III stands outside a rebellious city near a battering ram that has always looked to me rather elephantine. The king is portrayed as towering above his enemies, and the mismatched dimensions paradoxically shrink the gap between dominator and subjugated as the king trains a bow, the symbol of masculinity par excellence, at those who would dare challenge him. Meanwhile, the king's soldiers kill and maim from no distance at all, their hands yanking back the hair of diminished rebels to steady their grip as they cut their throats. Fearless, merciless hunters of human prey. These reliefs, like the Assyrian royal inscriptions and so many other sources from ancient West Asia, including a large number of biblical texts, rely on a master metaphor of war as a hunt, in which conquerors are portrayed as predators hunting and slaughtering subjugated enemies cast as prey animals. These sources demarcate, manipulate, and reinforce human, animal, person, non-person boundaries in a variety of ways, but all in the service of a domination personhood that links together extreme violence, hypermasculinity, and physical dominance. Dehumanizing violence, whether performed or threatened, often in very dramatic ways, is central to these reliefs and to ancient West Asian conceptions of personhood and masculinity more broadly. These are phenomena that I've explored at length in my 2017 book on violence and personhood, as well as in other publications. In my lecture 2 days ago, however, I delved more deeply into the phenomenon of dehumanization in cross-cultural and trans-historical perspective, proposing a typology of dehumanization with cross-cultural application. The animalizing type of dehumanization that the Assyrian sources exemplify so well is one of the most important and most common types of dehumanization that one sees in cross-cultural contexts of violence. It is certainly the most common type of dehumanization found in ancient West Asian sources, though the cultures of this region also refer to and marshal other types of dehumanization and their varied practices of violence. In this lecture, I will focus on the Judeans' experiences with the imperial violence of the Mesopotamians, as these experiences are described in a couple of biblical books in particular, Isaiah and Leviticus, but making use of other biblical texts and extra-biblical sources from the mid-first millennium BCE when appropriate. The lecture will be divided, roughly speaking, into 2 major parts. The first half will address the animalizing form of dehumanization and discuss how passages in the book of Isaiah respond to this animalization in an evocative but highly inconsistent fashion. The second half of the lecture will address evidence for the use of a different form of dehumanization in Assyrian and Babylonian imperial violence, the association of victims of violence with disgust or disgust-inducing substances. This type of dehumanization existed in this region alongside the animalizing type, as well as other types of dehumanization. Like animalization, biblical texts not only evince the use of this form of dehumanization, but also present us with evidence for cultural responses to it, this time more far-reaching and immediately influential ones. These responses we see especially in that most maligned, but nonetheless extremely powerful book, Leviticus. I will argue here that the prescriptions for purity and purification outlined in Leviticus offer Judeans a potent mode of rehumanization from the filth association type of dehumanizing violence. Both Leviticus and Isaiah exemplify well that the rhetoric and the realities of dehumanizing violence were multifaceted and complex. This being so, the processes of rehumanization required of the Judeans as a culture to repair the damage imperial violence had wreaked upon them too were multifaceted and complex, but also specific to the forms of violence experienced. It is this complexity, as well as this specificity, that I will explore today in this lecture. I'll begin with Isaiah. The book of Isaiah is rife with images of violence. Arguably, and perhaps surprisingly for those predisposed to think of Isaiah as bright and optimistic, there is no biblical book more saturated with such images. Images of violence are not just pervasive in Isaiah, but incredibly varied. A significant number of these evince what I call domination personhood, a view of personhood that links together hypermasculinity, physical dominance, and dehumanizing violence. In ancient West Asia, domination personhood is so often predicated on animalizing frameworks that depict dominant males as predators and subordinated opponents as prey. The book of Isaiah is like many other texts in the Hebrew Bible in that it not only attests to the pervasiveness of animalizing violence in this region, but indeed even promotes animalizing violence by presenting Yahweh as the agent of it or by characterizing such violence as justified or laudable. In the next few moments, I will discuss an example of what I mean here when I say Isaiah promotes this violence, and then I will move to presenting examples of how there are also passages in Isaiah that do just the opposite by subverting or resisting both domination personhood and animalizing dehumanization. Despite the pacifistic notion many readers have of the book of Isaiah, when one examines this book with an eye to issues of violence, one sees rather quickly that popular notions may not align with the realities of the book's contents and the role violence actually plays in it. In fact, one need not venture more than a few verses into the book's first chapter to encounter images of violence and weaponry. Animals, animal imagery, and animalization at times figure prominently in Isaiah in passages that describe or promote violence. Let us examine Isaiah 34 as a kind of parade example of Isaiah's promotion of dehumanizing violence of the animalizing type. In Isaiah 34:2 and following, we read, "For Yahweh feels rage against all the nations and ire against all their armies. He has performed cherem against them and has given them over for slaughter. Their slain shall be cast out, and the stench of their corpses shall rise. The mountains shall flow with their blood." The text continues with Yahweh speaking in the first person as human and animal imagery are juxtaposed. "For it is satiated, my sword in the heavens. Behold, upon Edom it descends, and upon a people my cherem descends for judgment. The sword of Yahweh is full of blood. It is engorged with fat, from the blood of lambs and he-goats, from the fat of the kidneys of rams, because there is a sacrifice for Yahweh in Bozrah, a great slaughter in the land of Edom, and wild oxen have descended with them, and steers with the bull strong." Isaiah 34 yokes together punitive violence and images of dehumanization. It clearly equates a group targeted by Yahweh for slaughter with animals. The passage includes the word cherem, a type of ritual violence in which victim groups are entirely eliminated, down to men, women, children, and sometimes even livestock. In Isaiah 34, this cutting down of groups deemed sinful is likened to the slaughter of animals. As one uses bladed weapons to take the lives of animals, making their crimson blood flow upon the land and loosing their inner parts, so Yahweh cuts down the Edomites with his fearsome sword and makes their blood flow in the streets of Bozrah. In Isaiah 63, in fact, Bozrah appears again as the city from which Yahweh treads forth in blood-drenched clothing, having struck down both foreign nations and his own covenanted people in the hot breath of his anger. These passages exemplify what we see all too frequently in the Bible, a naturalization and propagation of domination personhood, where social recognition of status, physical dominance, and violence are intertwined, and dominant men punish transgressive inferiors with dehumanization. This propagation is made even more powerful when the agent of dehumanizing punishment is imagined as Yahweh himself. It's ironic, perhaps, that in a book that plays as much as Isaiah does on images of light and darkness, that there is not a lot of daylight between this image in Isaiah 34 of mountains flowing with rivers of human blood and similar imagery in Assyrian royal inscriptions. In an inscription of Shalmaneser III, for instance, we read, "I felled with the sword their fighting men. I piled them in ditches and filled the extensive plain with the corpses of their warriors. Like wool, I dyed the mountain with their blood. I made a pile of heads in front of Hayani's city." In both the inscription from the dominating imperial monarch and the passage from the imperialized Levantine subject people, victory and dominance are expressed in terms of an overarching metaphor of animalization, wherein the victors are hunters and slayers of animals, both wild and domesticated, animals subjugated, controlled, and slaughtered, their blood spilling, flowing, dyeing the mountainsides. And if the examples from Isaiah 34 and Shalmaneser's annals seem not enough, trust that there are dozens more from Israelite and Mesopotamian texts of different stripes and dating to different periods. The framework of warfare as hunt, violence as animal slaughter, that is, the dehumanizing framework expressed in a more specifically animalizing fashion, was a pervasive one in this region for well over a millennium. It is not surprising then that in Isaiah 34 and other passages like it, terrible violence is the just deserts of the sinful, and it is Yahweh or his proxies who wield the bludgeons of dehumanizing violence. Foreign armies become instruments of a God who himself marches forth with furious breaths of rage against those whom he marks for destruction. What is surprising is that as much as such passages normalize and reinforce the ideology of domination personhood, including its most dehumanizing aspects, other chapters in Isaiah present us with equally evocative passages that seem to call into question this very ideology. Most prominent of these, perhaps, is the servant song in Isaiah 52 to 53, the longest and most influential of the servant songs in Deutero-Isaiah, the portion of Isaiah spanning chapters 40 to 55. This servant song, in fact, offers a powerful refutation of domination personhood through its unique and eventually incredibly influential depiction of suffering. While the lion's share of passages in the Hebrew Bible that speak of suffering presume that suffering is the result of transgression, this passage asserts the very opposite, at least where the servant is concerned. He had done no violence, and there was no deceit in his mouth, Isaiah 53:9 tells us. The suffering of the servant is not a punishment for his own sin, but is rather an offering that atones for the sin of others. His life, his nephesh, is an asham, an offering that atones for guilt. The servant's suffering is real, but it is not understood as being wholly negative, which is the more typical stance of texts in the Hebrew Bible toward suffering. Instead, it apparently serves a sacrificial purpose. This conception of suffering as vicarious atonement is rare or otherwise absent in the Hebrew Bible. The servant suffers violence that physically marks his body. As we saw above, dehumanizing violence that treats human bodies as if they were animal bodies is a very frequent punishment for insubordination against Yahweh or against dominant humans in the Hebrew Bible. At first glance, the violence to which the servant is subjected appears to be par for the course. What the servant suffers makes him like an animal. He was oppressed and he was subordinated, yet he did not open his mouth. Like a lamb led to the slaughter, and like a ewe who before her shearers is silent, so he did not open his mouth. The servant is beaten, bruised, and apparently slaughtered, and is like an animal in all this. In Isaiah 50 as well, the servant is the victim of violence that appears animalizing. I gave my back to those who struck me, and my cheeks to those who plucked out my beard. Like an animal, the servant is beaten and plucked. The beatings also make the servant like a slave. In fact, the word translated as servant, eved, could just as easily be translated as slave. The servant is, we could aver, both slave and animal here. Yet here too, the servant/slave suffering is explicitly stated not to be punishment for rebellion. Isaiah 50, and especially Isaiah 52 to 53, deviate from other texts in the way they understand the passivity and animalization of the servant. These experiences are not cast as wholly negative. While the terrible weight of the servant's suffering is acknowledged and its dehumanizing character recognized, the suffering is not merely dehumanizing. The servant is not merely a slaughtered lamb, but is instead a sacrificial offering. Such offerings are described as holy and most holy in other biblical texts, and so one can plausibly infer that there is a sanctity to this suffering. Rather than the usual punishment, there is something far greater. Not only does it atone for the sins of others, it apparently leads to flourishing and exaltation for the servant himself, as we read in 52:13. Thus, one may conclude that Isaiah 52 to 53 resists or even refutes the dehumanizing frameworks so common in ancient West Asia by upending all of the assumptions associated with them. A man is subjected to dehumanizing and emasculating violence, not as a punishment for his transgressions, but to bear the sins of others. Though his body is beaten, plucked, and handled as if it were an animal body, and he is subjected to ridicule and humiliation, he is not shamed, but is in the end glorified. The annals of Assyrian kings, Isaiah 34 and Isaiah 52 to 53 are part of the same conversation about dehumanizing violence, but this servant song or animalized slave song in Isaiah has something very different to say. There's another passage in Isaiah that is perhaps equally striking for the way in which it appends the portrayal of suffering, subordination, and animalization that one sees in dozens of other biblical texts. That passage is Isaiah 56. It is one of my favorite biblical passages, I will say. As we have already seen, violence that mutilates the body is depicted as a form of punishment and a source of shame in dozens of texts from various regions of ancient West Asia, including ancient Israel. The God of Israel, rather than standing against this type of violence, sometimes threatens or performs it himself. In accordance with this, in Deuteronomy 23, men who have suffered genital damage, a fate that would arise as a result of violence or accidents, are excluded from the assembly of Yahweh for this blemish. In other words, if a Judean captured by the Babylonians were made a eunuch through the crushing of his testicles, the typical way this was achieved in the region, the laws in Deuteronomy barred him from worshiping Yahweh. Thus, one terrible fate was compounded by another. Deuteronomy 23 also excludes foreigners from the worship of Yahweh, penalizing those forced by Mesopotamian empires to migrate far from their own lands to the land of the Israelites from being able to worship the God of the people among whom they lived. Again, one terrible fate seems compounded by another. Notably, it is not only to contemporary readers that the precepts of Deuteronomy 23 seem unjust. In Isaiah 56 as well, we see not only discomfort with these precepts of Yahweh, but a clear rejection of them. We read in verses 3 through 8, "Do not let the foreigner who has joined himself to Yahweh say, Yahweh will surely separate me from his people. And do not let the eunuch say, I am just a dried up tree. For thus says Yahweh to the eunuchs who keep my Sabbaths, who choose what pleases me and hold fast my covenant. I will give in my house and within my walls a monument and a name better than sons and daughters, an everlasting name I will give to them that shall not be cut off. And the foreigners who join themselves to Yahweh to minister to him, to love the name of Yahweh, to be his servants, these I will bring to my holy mountain and make them joyful in my house of prayer. For my house will be called a house of prayer for all the peoples. Oracle of the Lord Yahweh, who gathers the scattered ones of Israel. I will gather others to them besides those already gathered." Rather than carrying out mutilations, excluding those mutilated against their will, or penalizing those who would choose to glorify Yahweh despite their foreign parentage, the Yahweh we see in Isaiah 56 welcomes such individuals. This Yahweh demands his house of prayer be one for all peoples and refutes the assumption that a man emasculated through the mutilation of his genitals was so lowly that he was not even fit to participate in the Yahwistic cult. As in Isaiah 50 and 52 to 53, individuals who have suffered dehumanizing violence do not just maintain their personhood. Their claim to personhood is so strong that they are even celebrated. Yahweh bestows on them something even more valuable than the valuable things that they have lost. Rather than personhood as a zero-sum game where only those with the power to physically dominate others are afforded status and protection, Yahweh recognizes those brutalized by violence. Clearly, one can only conclude that the book of Isaiah features an ambivalent attitude toward dehumanizing violence. The book features two passages that are particularly resistant toward the frameworks of domination, personhood, and dehumanization. Isaiah 56 resists dehumanizing violence in a more general way, though its focus on castration could relate to animalization. Certainly Isaiah 52 to 53, as well as Isaiah 50, seem to resist or refute animalization in particular. They either explicitly refer to the treatment of the servant being like the treatment of an animal, or they describe behaviors performed on animals, such as sacrifice, more generalized slaughter, beating, and plucking. Like Assyrian royal inscriptions, Isaiah compares victims of violence to sheep and describes the manipulation and mutilation of their bodies. But the servant songs in Isaiah 56 reject the assumption that such treatment was necessarily deserved, merely castigating, or merely humiliating. In this way, these texts shake the very foundations upon which ancient West Asian dehumanizing violence was built. These texts reflect the views of their human authors, and the contradictions between texts in Isaiah and texts elsewhere in the Hebrew Bible on how animalizing violence should be seen demonstrate that there was some disagreement among Israelites. Israelites and Judeans living in the aftermath of imperial violence in the exilic and early post-exilic periods apparently disagreed about how they should understand the violence that they had seen, or that they or their parents or grandparents had seen or experienced. Were they dehumanized? Were they shamed? Had Yahweh himself been the author of their suffering and humiliation? Had he been the author of the sometimes extreme violence that their people, his own people, had experienced? In Isaiah 51, 19 through 20, we read that children grow faint from the hot anger of Yahweh. These two things have happened to you. Who will feel sorry for you? Devastation and destruction, famine and sword, who will be with you? Your children have fainted. They lie at the head of every street like an antelope in a net. They are full of the hot anger of Yahweh, the rebuke of your God. Texts in Isaiah describe the day of Yahweh as a day of child slaughter and a day of rape. Yahweh musters human armies against other human groups, armies merciless in smashing children to pieces. Their weapons of dehumanization are an extension of God's own will. The redactors of Isaiah merely collected such widely divergent passages as Isaiah 34, Isaiah 51, Isaiah 52 to 53, and Isaiah 56 and placed them in the same book. There is no systematic attempt to refute animalizing violence, only bursts of resistance that quickly give way to passages reflecting instead the more pervasive cultural views of dehumanization as punishment and humiliation. While we see evidence that some people in the exilic or post-exilic periods saw fit to question in rather dramatic terms the assumptions of domination, personhood, and animalization, this questioning, while not wiped from the historical record, was unable to drown out the voices of dehumanization coming not from without, but rather from within the Judean community itself. While the resistance and refutation of dehumanizing violence is hardly comprehensive in Isaiah, however beloved by Christians the passages that evince such resistance might be, we do find a more sustained reaction to dehumanization in that most orderly and most maligned of biblical books, Leviticus. I'll be proposing today a very different understanding of the purity constructions found in Leviticus than what is typical among either biblical scholars or everyday readers of the Bible. More specifically, I will examine how Leviticus and other purity-interested texts from the early post-exilic period respond to dehumanization. However, rather than responding to the animalizing type of dehumanization, as Isaiah does, these texts seem to be responding to another form of dehumanization that we find evidence for in ancient West Asia. The form in which victimized groups are associated with or equated with disgust-inducing body fluids, and in which the disgust-inducing aspects of violence and subjugation are emphasized. I will assess the purity language of Leviticus and other contemporary biblical texts in light of sources from both ancient Israel and Mesopotamia that connect victimization with physical filth, vomit, dirt, and feces, and a sense of filthiness and disgust, and propose that the purity rules in Leviticus can be fruitfully examined as a form of communal rehumanization. I will draw upon new materialist approaches today as I examine the purity constructions of Leviticus and focus on what I will suggest are their rehumanizing aspects. In my view, new materialist approaches to disgust as well as to purity, melding evolutionist, cognitive science, and culturalist methods have been particularly fruitful. I have in mind not only Paul Rosen's work on disgust, but also Thomas Kazan's extensive work on biblical purity that draws on Rosen and other cognitive scientists. If we approach purity from a new materialist perspective, we might ask, how is the innate human capacity for disgust developed, molded, and weaponized in different cultural contexts, and especially in contexts of violence? How do groups experience and respond to this weaponization? The association of victims with filth, dirt, or garbage is a rather common form of dehumanization cross-culturally. Nonetheless, we must ascertain whether the Mesopotamian imperial violence of the first millennium BCE involved the manipulation and weaponization of disgust responses, particularly since not every type of dehumanization is found in every context of violence. In fact, we do see this disgust association type of dehumanization in sources originating from Mesopotamian imperial aggressors as well as from victim groups. Body fluids feature quite prominently in Assyrian royal inscriptions, with blood unsurprisingly being most prominent of all. We read in the annals of Sennacherib, for example, the wheels of my war chariot, which lays criminals and villains low, were bathed in blood and gore. I filled the plain with the corpses of their warriors like grass. I cut off their lips and thus destroyed their pride. I cut off their hands like the stems of cucumbers in season. Neo-Assyrian royal inscriptions are rife with statements of this kind, with kings reveling in the prodigious scale of their bloodletting. Of course, while Sennacherib and other kings might revel in this violence, one can imagine how for survivors, the sight of rivers of blood dyeing the mountains red might provoke disgust. So too the experience of being covered in blood, which one might not soon have the opportunity to wash off, and thus might become caked on one's clothing and skin, with its minerally smell becoming more and more fetid. And blood is certainly not the only body fluid that appears in Assyrian sources on violence. Various texts state that victims were so consumed with panic that even experienced warriors urinated, defecated, or vomited at what they saw. The annals of Sennacherib state repeatedly of enemy soldiers. Their hearts throbbed like the pursued young of pigeons. They passed their urine hotly and released their excrement inside their chariots. We also find other phrasings such as, terror of doing serious battle with me overwhelmed the king of the land of Elam and the king of Babylon, and they released their excrement inside their chariots. Their hearts were pounding, and they were vomiting gall. Ashurbanipal states that one group of fugitives grew so desperate that they resorted to cutting open their camels to drink their blood and excrement to quench their thirst. If this were an everyday occurrence, it is hard to imagine why the Assyrians would boast of it. Thus, we see in various Assyrian texts a focus on the fluids, and how these are connected with extreme violence, dread, and one imagines disgust. Neo-Babylonian sources are admittedly less forthcoming on these matters, since they are both less plentiful than Neo-Assyrian and less graphic in their descriptions of imperial violence. Still, Babylonian mythological traditions, Israelite descriptions of Babylonian violence, and archaeological evidence of the destruction wrought by Babylonian armies together seem to indicate that the Babylonians did not differ from the Assyrians in their willingness to subject transgressive subject peoples to extreme violence. It is easy to conclude then that both of the imperial powers that ravaged Israel and Judah in the first millennium utilized dehumanizing, traumatizing violence. And while discussed elements are better evinced in Assyrian sources, it seems plausible that the Babylonians too may have weaponized or emphasized disgust in some fashion in their execution of imperial violence. In fact, Israelite and Judean texts from the Neo-Babylonian period and later themselves seem to support this. Disgust figures rather prominently in Israelite texts describing the imperial violence, forced migration, and exile of the 6th century BCE. I will provide just a few examples here of the many that one could marshal. In Lamentations 1, 8 through 9, for instance, we read, Jerusalem sinned grievously, so she has become a menstrual impurity, a nidah. All who honored her despise her, for they have seen her nakedness. She herself groans and turns her face away. Her impurity was in her skirts. She took no thought of her future. Her downfall was appalling, with none to comfort her. In 1:11, the narrator beseeches, Look, O Yahweh, and see how worthless I have become. Lamentations 2:11 speaks of tears and retching. My eyes are spent with weeping. My stomach churns. My bile is poured out on the ground because of the destruction of my people. Lamentations 3:45 states, You have made us refuse and rubbish among the peoples. In 4:14 through 15 reads, They wandered like blind men through the streets, so defiled with blood that no one was able to touch their clothes. Get away, you are impure. People shouted at them, Get away, away, don't touch us. So they became fugitives and wanderers. The language of disgust is also present in texts from Jeremiah and Ezekiel that speak of exile and imperial violence. Jeremiah repeatedly uses the language of being shocked or appalled, of abomination and of disgust, as in Jeremiah 6:8, Take warning, O Jerusalem, or I shall turn from you in disgust and make you a desolation. Ezekiel is, of course, famous for his images of exile, which combine rage, self-hatred, and disgust with graphic violence and sexuality. Ezekiel emphasizes the impurity and grotesqueness of blood, menstrual blood and feces, and even describes the voluminous ejaculate of Judah's enemies. The impurity and disgust surrounding bodies and body fluids are not incidental to this book. No, they take center stage and hew closely to Ezekiel's priestly concerns and worldview. These intersections are also pivotal in the priestly text found in the Torah. The Holiness collection in Leviticus, in fact, characterizes exile as an act of vomiting. On 4 occasions in Leviticus 18 and 20, the language of vomit is used, with the Israelites being warned not to engage in prohibited behaviors, because by doing so, previous inhabitants of the land had defiled themselves, and the land had then vomited them out. If the Israelites should transgress, the land would do the same to them. The setting of the text is a putative Mosaic past predating the exile. But what the Holiness collection is in fact doing, it's characterizing the forced migration of the Judeans in the 6th century BCE as an act of regurgitation and bodily expulsion by the land itself. The people do not just elicit nausea through their behavior. They themselves are vomited out of their own land into the land of their conquerors. They become the vomit of exile. We see then that disgust centered specifically on bodily experiences and body fluids, the fluids of death, the fluids of rape, the fluids of impurity, figures prominently in the imaginations, memories, and psyches of biblical authors. Impurity and disgust are best understood in these texts as both culturally differentiated and as intersecting phenomena. In light of these connections, which are so evocatively made in various exilic and postexilic texts, it is perhaps not surprising that Judean exiles and their descendants would seek ways of processing and overcoming the disgust and impurity of fluids if these fluids had been connected with violence and trauma. Having been, in their minds, reduced to garbage and filth, the refuse of the streets, the off-scouring of their God, it is perhaps unsurprising that the Judeans would devote cultural attention to recovery from this aspect of their trauma. If, in ancient West Asia, violence was so often ritualized, dehumanization was ritualized, would we not expect that rehumanization would itself be ritualized? To put this another way, is it not likely that some repeated and coherent framework or set of practices might arise in response to particular forms of dehumanizing violence that the Judeans had experienced? This is, I tentatively argue, precisely what we see in late exilic and post-exilic biblical materials. Let me begin with Zechariah 3, a quite interesting text in which Joshua, the first high priest of the post-exilic era, appears in a vision wearing, if you will excuse the blunt language, shit-stained garments. We read, "The angel said to those who were standing before him, 'Take off his shit-stained clothes.' And to him he said, 'See, I have taken your guilt away from you, and I will clothe you in festal apparel.' And I said, 'Let them put a pure turban on his head.' So they put a pure turban on his head and clothed him in the garments, and the angel of Yahweh was standing by." Thus we see that the guilt of Joshua, which is presumably the guilt of exile and the guilt of the community of exiles, is symbolized by fecal matter that clings even to the fineries of cult. Before that cult could recommence in the Jerusalem temple, Joshua must be divested of his filthy garments and fitted instead with pure clothes. In Ezekiel 36 as well, the filth and transgression of the exiles, which is described in that text, as in earlier passages in Ezekiel, as being like the filth of menstrual blood, is purged through a ritual action. Yahweh sprinkles purifying waters over them, and so they are cleansed. And here we come at last to Leviticus, that most famous of post-exilic priestly texts. Purification is what the book of Leviticus is all about. Sacrifices and cleansing, sacrifices to achieve cleansing. The defilement of body fluids figures extremely prominently in Leviticus. Now, one must emphasize the fact that post-exilic priestly sources do not invent the idea that body fluids could be contaminating to sancta. This idea finds expression in earlier Israelite sources as well as in Mesopotamian ones. This is a common idea in antiquity. Where Leviticus differs is in the depth and length of focus on these issues. If one compares Israelite legal collections to the extensive corpora of Mesopotamian legal materials, the biblical focus on impurity certainly stands out. Mesopotamian legal collections, when they speak of the cult, are much more interested in regulating the property transfers and marital behaviors of cultic functionaries than they are in delineating purification procedures. Presumably, these collections take cultic purity and purification, which Mesopotamian sources refer to elsewhere, as a given. But purity, or to speak more precisely, the ability to become purified, was certainly not a given for the authors of Ezekiel or Lamentations, sources that devote intense emotionality to the disgust and impurity of exile and imperial violence. Nor was purification taken as a given by the post-exilic community attempting to revive the cult. Even decades after the destruction of the Jerusalem temple, the intersection of disgust and impurity emerges in the image of the shit-stained priest in Zechariah 3. It also emerges in the description of exile as a vomiting out in Leviticus 18 and 20. Yet, the priestly sources in Leviticus add to the focus something quite significant by offering to the post-exilic community a detailed program of purification. In Ezekiel 36, Yahweh himself might sprinkle the exiles with water, but there is no strategy offered to the exiles for how they might act to purify themselves, besides being horrified by their own filthy bodies and behavior. Similarly, Lamentations beseeches Yahweh to take action, and Zechariah 2 imagines purification as coming from the divine realm. But the priestly source in Leviticus offers a strategy of human action to resolve human impurities, as well as clear instructions on how to avoid impurities of various sorts and how to alleviate unavoidable impurities through ritual means. If imperial violence had weaponized the sense of disgust, leaving victims with a perduring sense of their own filthiness and impurity, Leviticus in a way neutralizes that weapon, offering a path to purification and perhaps even a path to healing. Now, I think that I must anticipate two questions or possible objections that might be raised to this understanding of Leviticus. The first regards the fact that the priestly sources in Leviticus do not construct feces or vomit as defiling. It is interesting that Leviticus and Numbers do not classify fecal matter as defiling. In this, they deviate from all various other biblical sources, including Zechariah, Ezekiel, Deuteronomy, and 2 Kings, which do regard such matter as impure. We can only speculate on why this is. It may relate to the greater difficulty of controlling the emission of feces and vomit. For example, a priest could become ill and inadvertently vomit or soil himself in the temple precinct, and thus endanger the temple's sanctity. The post-exilic priestly writers may have been concerned that if feces or vomit were constructed as impure, this could increase the threat to the maintenance of purity. Perhaps they were concerned enough about this that they attempted to shift what seems to have been a long-standing view in Israelite culture that feces, at least, were defiling. This shift would have either purposefully or inadvertently spared Judeans subjected to certain forms of filth association from having to worry about the cultic implications of that filth association. In any case, this rather unexpected absence in Leviticus, the book is certainly concerned with impurity and the impurity of body fluids more generally, and I think this overall focus is more central here than the treatment of particular body fluids. A second question that could be raised would be this. If the cultural and psychological sequelae of imperial violence form the backdrop for Leviticus's focus on purity, why doesn't the book discuss this violence more directly? This is also an interesting question. For one thing, the putative Mosaic context of Leviticus made directly addressing Babylonian violence impossible. While Ezekiel and Lamentations could directly refer to their contemporary context of violence, only indirect references fit within Leviticus's framework. We find these in the form of references to the land vomiting out transgressors, which is, according to most scholars, a clear reference to exile. Another issue is that returnees were not themselves the victims of imperial violence. Rather, they were the descendants of those victims. Despite the lack of direct experience with violence, the sense of impurity apparently remained in the descendants of those exiled, as we see in Zechariah and Leviticus. Perhaps this was because these descendants had a limited ability to purify themselves in exile, or because their parents and grandparents were left with such an abiding sense of their own impurity and filthiness that they inculcated this into their descendants. In fact, we see in cases of extreme violence from the contemporary world evidence that trauma can affect families and communities for 3 or more generations. We also see in contemporary evidence that victims of violence frequently experience a strong desire to bathe, both to wash the fluids of violence off of themselves and also to try to wash the experience of violence off of themselves in order to feel clean again. Post-exilic purity rituals would seem to provide a framework in which this could occur, both for individuals and for the community as a whole. A woman who was raped would wash herself and remain ritually impure one day, just as she would after any sexual intercourse. A Judean who encountered dead bodies in a wartime context would follow the ritual procedures outlined in Numbers 19, another priestly text, for alleviating corpse impurity of any sort and then be clean. If one became covered in feces or vomit, this was not a problem. According to Leviticus, those fluids do not lead to ritual impurity and thus would not endanger one's relationship with the deity. Further, the Holiness Collection outlines which behaviors are out of bounds and lead to so-called moral impurity. If those behaviors were avoided, then the Judeans would never again be vomited out of their land. If they did sin, this is what the Day of Atonement was for. Despite Jonathan Klewan's assertion that moral impurity could not be cleansed, I think James Watts and Christoph Niehan are right in stating that to the contrary, the Yom Kippur rituals outlined in Leviticus 16 were in fact meant to alleviate deviations and impurities of various kinds, including moral ones. From the two different priestly sources in Leviticus and Numbers, then, Judeans could learn which behaviors to avoid, which fluids rendered one impure and which did not, as well as how to alleviate any resultant impurity. These sources are both backward and forward-looking, and that they show an awareness of the catastrophes of the past and provide guidelines for how to avoid such catastrophes in the future. They also present instructions for alleviating impurity in the present that involve bathing, washing clothes, and the sacrifice of animals. We see then, in biblical sources of the exilic and postexilic periods, evidence of a group struggling with effects of violence that had lingered months, decades, or even generations. Of course, evidence from more recent episodes of extreme violence has shown that this is hardly atypical. I focused in this latter half of the lecture on the type of dehumanization that is centered on bodily disgust, i.e. the objectification type, describing how this type of violence is attested in biblical and extra-biblical sources and how biblical writers attempted to alleviate its effects in ritualized ways. Now, it is important to remember that rituals of purity and impurity were not new to this culture. The authors of Leviticus do not invent these practices, but they do group them together in a generally organized and sustained fashion during a period in which various biblical authors seem quite concerned with matters of purity, and particularly with the impurity of fluids and the impurity of violence. The fact that these practices were already known likely would have made the marshaling of them in a time of widespread concern over the bodily experiences of violence all the more powerful and efficacious. The utilization of recognizable frameworks and the attempts of priestly writers to reconstitute and repair their community may have been one of the primary reasons why the purity laws of Leviticus and Numbers apparently became so widely accepted in the Second Temple period. While the act of bathing and changing into clean clothes may seem to us small things, exilic and postexilic texts reinforce what we see too in contemporary accounts of trauma, that washing away the filth of violence is indeed no small thing. In Lamentations, Jerusalem is reduced to the filth that clings to her. In Leviticus, Jerusalem's children wash that filth away. And with this, I return to Ashurbanipal and his animals. The Mesopotamian kings, with their lion hunts and dismembered human victims, produced complex discourses of dehumanization and dehumanizing violence that were culturally and historically specific, but also in many ways continuous with the discourses of dehumanization seen elsewhere in the region. The Judeans themselves did not simply capitulate to their own dehumanization, but neither did they simply resist dehumanization. Often, they promoted the same discourses and practices of dehumanizing violence that their conquerors did, merely replacing the Assyrian or Babylonian king as animalizing warrior with Yahweh. Their resistance against imperial violence was not always or even usually a resistance against dehumanization as a general practice. On the other hand, the scale of devastation wrought by the Assyrians, and especially by the Babylonians of the 6th century BCE, required a response from Judeans. and indeed gave rise to a complex set of responses that were hardly uniform even within the same book. Isaiah, that book so often stereotyped as sunny and optimistic, promotes animalizing violence much more often than it resists it. Still, those passages in which animalization is called into question are powerful ones and became influential much later on, as we know, even if in the time of Deutero-Isaiah, that author's questioning of animalizing violence seemingly failed to generate broader cultural practices. His response did not become the consensus stance of Judean texts of the time period, nor was his response consistent even within that subsection of Isaiah. By contrast, the authors of Leviticus present a much more thoroughgoing and actionable response to another type of dehumanization, objectification through association with filth. If texts from Ezekiel, Lamentations, Zechariah, and Leviticus are any indication, this type of dehumanization had left a very real imprint on the psyches of Judean victims and their descendants. Leviticus either reflected a communal response and move toward rehumanization and healing, or created one, or both. In any case, the practices that it advocates were much more widely adopted in the post-exilic period than Deutero-Isaiah's refutation of animalization apparently was. Still, examining Isaiah and Leviticus side by side is, I think, instructive. Just like the reliefs of the Assyrians who had brutalized them, the responses of Israelites and Judeans to brutalizing violence have endured. Theirs is perhaps the most multifaceted collection of texts written by a dehumanized people in antiquity. Certainly, it is the most well-known. Just as this collection serves as a useful case study for historians of violence of the phenomenon of dehumanization in antiquity, so does it serve as a useful case study for understanding rehumanization, not only in antiquity, but in our own contemporary moment, when recovery from extreme violence is sadly as needed as ever. Like the Judeans, our stomachs churn before the violence we see both far and near, and we too await our time of healing. Thank you.